well, the guy go to jail. But the banks are the one industry that's allowed to get away with this and to profit from it.
Alexander Hamilton became the first Treasury Secretary, and in 1791 set up the first Bank of the United States as America's central bank to expand the supply of paper money for the benefit of the government and the commercial banks.
Alexander Hamilton believed in a strong central government, and he saw a central bank as one of the means by which the government could be centralized and by which its power could be expressed.
Thomas Jefferson opposed this view. He saw a central bank as an undemocratic tool of the northeastern banking establishment. It was dismantled after 20 years.
Jefferson was an opponent of a strong central government, and at all costs wanted to remove the central bank.
In 1816, the federal government made another attempt to set up an inflationary central bank. But this second Bank of the United States was denounced by President Andrew Jackson as a monster bank for benefiting a few at the expense of many.
They inflated the money supply, which brought about a boom initially, that is prosperity to the country, followed by a bust. When they stopped inflating the money supply, many businesses that had depended on the low interest rates that were introduced or induced by the initial inflation went out of business.
Jackson succeeded in abolishing the second central bank in 1836. But by then, speculators had set up hundreds of new private banks with little or no gold to back the notes they issued. The nation's monetary system became more stable when the United States introduced a gold standard in 1834. The dollar was worth approximately 1/20th of an ounce of gold.
The gold standard was understood by the Founding Fathers, by Andrew Jackson and others, as being a money of the people. That is, it was a hard money, a money that could not be tampered with, that could not be inflated to permit government expenditures skyrocketing.
But by 1862, Abraham Lincoln needed to fund his invasion of the South. So once again, the government began to print up paper money.
Basically, the United States went off the gold standard in order to finance the Civil War. Okay. And you'll find in history that almost every large war, every major war, has involved a departure from the gold standard, because the gold standard puts strict limits on government financing.
Lincoln's notes became known as greenbacks because they were printed in green ink rather than the usual black ink on the reverse side. These so-called fiat notes were deemed legal tender by the government, but they were not redeemable in gold.
Lincoln, under cover of war, issued tremendous numbers of greenbacks. Gold was still circulating, but people were forced to accept these greenbacks as if they were at par with gold.
The government's power to print unbacked paper notes would later become the pillar of the Federal Reserve System. After the Civil War, the nation's monetary system became sounder when the U.S. adopted a gold standard.
We went back on the gold standard in 1879 and had probably the greatest period of growth and of prosperity ever in the country's history.
For nearly 20 years, the total output of goods and services grew at an unprecedented rate of 4% per year.
The reason being that with a sound money and without the ability to manipulate the interest rate, we had a lot of genuine saving and investment, which then led to more capital goods and higher labor productivity in the United States.
In the midst of this prosperity, the big industrialists and financiers were plotting to expand their empires with the help of government. With the passage of the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887, the large railroads succeeded in blocking their smaller competitors through regulation.
The ICC was put in place in order to protect the railroad owners from competition. Okay, it was not the case that it was going to protect consumers or shippers. In fact, Consumers were hurt because ultimately, with higher railroad rates, they were forced to pay higher prices for the goods and services that were shipped across the country.
By 1896, they were poised to do the same thing with the banks. Two camps emerged as leaders in this economic war. They were led by J.P. Morgan, the world's most powerful private banker, and John D. Rockefeller, the oil tycoon. Morgan and Rockefeller were great adversaries, but despite their business differences, they both favored a central bank. They wanted cheap credit and an inflated money supply to finance the expansion of their empires. Together, they led the campaign to sell the idea to the American public, which later led to the founding of the Federal Reserve.
If the American people got wind of the fact that this bank was not in their interests, okay, if in fact they understood that it was in the interests of the financial elites who would use it to inflate the money supply and in doing so increase their own revenues, there would have been hell to pay. The legislation would have never passed under those conditions. So it had to be sold to the American people as a way of making their currency more elastic.
The bank reform campaign received a boost in 1907, when there was a run on some of New York's biggest banks thanks to their fractional reserves. Panic spread among depositors who got wind of the bank's insolvency and tried to withdraw their money. The Knickerbocker Trust failed, and two other institutions went to the brink of bankruptcy despite a $35 million bailout from J.P. Morgan. Wall Street swiftly adopted the fear of bank failures to sell the idea of a central bank, or lender of last resort, to the American public.
And so the Federal Reserve was to be the lender of last resort. In case any bank got into trouble, they wouldn't have to worry. They'd get the cash from Washington, D.C.
The question is, however, whether it is really desirable to have such a thing as a lender of last resort. The correct position appears to me that every single bank should be responsible for its own debts and contractual obligations. And if banks, through imprudent policy, then go bankrupt, this should not be considered a bad thing, but in fact considered to be a magnificent thing, because bankruptcies, the danger of bankruptcies, is precisely what makes banks adhere to sound policies.
Bank runs and failures continued at an alarming rate. In 1908, the National Monetary Commission, headed by John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s father-in-law, Senator Nelson Aldrich, was set up to push for a central bank. In November of 1910, under the guise of a duck hunting trip, 6 men took a secret train ride to an exclusive private club on Jekyll Island, Georgia, to write a central banking act. The classified gathering read like a who's who of American banking. There were 2 Rockefeller men, Aldrich and Frank Vanderlip of the National City Bank of New York. 2 Morgan men, Henry P. Davidson from Morgan Bank and Charles D. Norton, president of Morgan's First National Bank of New York. Paul Warburg, a Kuhn Loeb partner, and Assistant Treasury Secretary A. P. Andrew, who was friendly to both camps. They spent a week at the luxurious club as Morgan's guests, crafting the proposals that would form the basis of the Federal Reserve System. It would be 3 years before their vision was realized. Just before Christmas, 1913, the Federal Reserve Act was passed by Congress and signed by President Wilson. It established a Federal Reserve System to oversee monetary policy and regulate the commercial banks.
It's no coincidence that the Federal Reserve System was established by the Wilson administration. This was the height of the Progressive era, a time of tremendous government expansion and of special interest deals in Washington.